Metropolitan Council of Community Mental Health Centers is a collaborative membership organization representing the public mental health system of community behavioral health centers serving the greater metropolitan Kansas City area. We provide support to our member organizations and education, information, and resources to the public on accessing quality health services. We host the Mental Health KC Conference every May, as well as providing free webinars on the second and the fourth Thursday of every month. At the end of the webinar today, we will put the link and password to get the certificates of attendance for this webinar. We are utilizing Zoom webinar, so you will be unable to see yourselves or each other in the Zoom, but you will be able to see the presenter today. For any questions or comments, please use the Q&A and chat options. Just a reminder, the views and opinions presented are those of the speaker and do not necessarily represent the opinions of Metro Council. Today, I am excited to introduce Dr. Jennifer Keller speaking on school avoidance. Dr. Keller is the Section Chief for Psychology and Senior Director of Behavioral Health at University Health, formerly Truman Medical Center. Also, she is a Clinical Assistant Professor of Psychiatry for UMKC. She is a licensed psychologist and health service provider in the state of Missouri. She has retired her license in Tennessee. She obtained her training in various settings, including inpatient psychiatric hospital, community mental health center, university counseling center, learning diagnostic clinic, multicultural center, and hospice. She works primarily with children and adolescents, though she provides some specific services for the adult population. She was previously employed at the University of Tennessee Martin, both as a staff psychologist and later as the clinical coordinator of counseling services. Dr. Keller was also formerly the pre-adolescent program director at Royal Oaks Hospital, where she provided and supervised clinical services on the pre-adolescent unit. Dr. Keller has been an adjunct professor at numerous colleges and universities in the area over her career. Dr. Keller is a registrant with the National Register of Health Service Providers in Psychology. She is a member of the American Psychological Association, APA Division 53, Society of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, APA Division 12, Society of Clinical Psychology, and the Missouri Psychological Association. Dr. Keller currently serves on the board for Newhouse Domestic Violence Shelter. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Keller.
All right, hopefully everybody can see the PowerPoint okay. I am also, this is my first time doing a presentation where I cannot see anyone. So this is going to be a unique experience for me. Generally speaking, I really like interaction and to be able to answer questions on the fly. So I'm going to attempt multitasking, and I have the webinar chat pulled up so that if you have questions as we go along, please feel free to go ahead and put those in there, and I'm going to try to answer those as we go. As for conflicts of interest, so I have no disclosures or conflicts of interest today. I will tell you I am going to plug a few resources. I get no royalties for those, though I probably should, but with as much as I utilize them, but they're often resources that I give parents and families that I work with. So I'll talk a little bit about some of those later, but again, no conflicts of interest. All right, so school avoidance. This is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. This is a population of kids and teens that I really enjoy working with. And so we'll get started. So the definition that we're going to work with today is that school avoidance or refusal is a child-motivated refusal to attend school and or difficulties remaining in class for an entire day. So this could entail being completely absent, which I will say is one of the most difficult to treat, depending on the length of time a kid has been completely absent. Attending but leaving early, arriving late, attending but misbehaving either to delay getting there or to delay going to classes, and any level of unusual distress. Now, this is a pretty overarching umbrella construct and represents really basically a child's inability to remain in school performing age-appropriate functions. So I will say Some level of school avoidance, though, and today a big focus of what we're going to talk about is not necessarily this, but some level of school avoidance is normal, developmentally so, and tends to be pretty transient, right? With school about to start, many kids are complaining, kind of begging not to go because, you know, they don't want summer to end. That's a pretty common phenomenon. However, for most of those kids, they end up going, and once they're at school, it's pretty reinforcing. They're glad to see their friends, maybe their teachers or activities, and it's transient. Then it's done with, right? Now, again, today we're going to talk more about those who persist in that effort, and it becomes more of an enduring chronic problem that interferes with their overall functioning. But most kids have some level of school avoidance, or at least that transient stuff in between, again, holidays, maybe during MAT testing, anytime there's a transition back to school. So in terms of chronic absences, the US Department of Education defines those as 15 days or more missed in an academic year, which is really, it's a lot if you think about what they would miss academically in 15 days. However, in the wide scheme of things, some people, I think this is how the problem gets out of control, is in 352 days in a year, 15 days doesn't seem like that much. Academically, though, this can be pretty detrimental. So if we look at absenteeism, I will say that, COVID absolutely impacted the level of absenteeism. And now post-COVID, we see some of these numbers of the chronically absent even doubling. Some numbers showing anywhere from pre-COVID being 8 million to now, like during the 21 to 22, some of the last school year data still isn't out, is 16 million. Now, of course, attendance rates, same thing, have definitely been dropping, and we have more absenteeism post-COVID as well. Now, I don't want to pretend that all of this is related just to mental health problems, right? COVID definitely exposed or exacerbated, a lot of pre-existing issues that were already there. It just highlighted them. And so absenteeism goes well beyond mental health issues. I mean, there are plenty of things that contribute, including things like physical illness, being unhoused, transportation issues. And again, today, that's not necessarily the scope of this particular presentation. We're going to focus more on kind of mental health, and more specifically anxiety or internalizing disorders that tend to contribute further to absenteeism, because at the crux of any anxiety disorder is avoidance and escape. And that's what we're going to focus a lot of our attention on. So school avoidance, the majority impacts 10 to 13-year-olds. And if you'll think about it, that tends to be that late elementary, middle school age, right? However, we also see peaks in 5 to 6-year-olds and 14 to 15-year-olds. And as you look at that, you can see those are big transitions, right? A child entering kindergarten or a teenager entering high school. So we've got this middle school making up kind of the majority, but we also see these peaks in those other kinds of transitions. They tend to present, clinically anyway, equal among boys and girls. Nevertheless, if we try to look at just kind of anxiety disorders in general, there tend to be a little more in girls than boys. And specifically, if we look at these kind of subgroups and these peaks, the 5 to 6-year-olds, what are your thoughts about like what anxiety disorder might present there? The most common? Separation anxiety, right? Like that is one of the most common in that age group. And if we think about 14 to 15-year-olds, what anxiety disorder do you think impacts that group? Social anxiety disorder, right? Those are two of those primary things that we see that present that often lead to school avoidance in those groups. And we'll talk more that there are other diagnoses besides these and other mental health conditions that can contribute, but those are some of the most common. So the consequences of this, right? So missing school in the first month predicts poor attendance throughout the year. That is why, with this being the timing of this, trying to address some of these issues as quickly as possible is crucial, right? We want to start out on kind of their best foot. So even if we're talking about some of those transient issues I mentioned, we have an opportunity right now to try to help kids prepare. So some parents, inadvertently kind of reinforce anxiety by not wanting to talk about it. If it creates some distress for their kid, they're not going to talk about it. But really, we should be talking about school starting. Kids oftentimes are going to bed very late, sleeping in, right? We should already be transitioning and kind of prepping those bedtimes and starting to go to bed a little bit earlier, getting up a little bit earlier, starting to put structure back into their days to try to prepare for school. I always encourage parents, if there are meet the teacher, orientations, those kinds of things, that they should attend those. Anytime we're exposing them more and more to school, we're trying to kind of desensitize them to it, prepare them. It's crucial. So we want to try to set them out kind of on best foot forward as the school year begins, because school really is a place where I think sometimes when I have conversations with parents who are reluctant to kind of push on their kid, school is not just about textbook knowledge, though that of course is crucial. It also is imperative for them to learn life skills. If you think about it, in going to school, you're learning how to navigate social relationships, right? You're learning how to deal with things that are unfair, following rules, maybe navigating those problems and trying to problem solve, dealing with bullies, trying to, cooperate, various kinds of skills that are life skills that help prepare them for life and the workforce, not just the textbook piece. And so as we look at some of these consequences and how detrimental they can be individually, but also societally, we're looking at this level of academic decline, which also then in turn can impact the kinds of jobs and positions they can get in their life. Poor socialization. Sometimes this leads to conflict at home, sometimes justice involvement, not only for the kid, right, but sometimes also for parents who might get charged with things related to truancy. And then, of course, increasing those dropout rates, which in turn we sometimes see with some of those things, an increase in mental health problems as people tend to be more isolated. They're less involved in life. And so, again, I think it's important that we really don't reinforce kind of escape of school. We really want them to be able to engage. I think that one thing that oftentimes when I'm working with parents is they tend to be very well-intentioned, and even at times school districts where we kind of the kids having problems, so we shift very quickly to homebound or to homeschool. And this can be so problematic because what we're doing is we're reinforcing this escape. We're reinforcing that they're not able to be at school. And what we want them to do is to be able to habituate over time and to be able to adjust. So today, this is one particular model that has research support that is one way to conceptualize school avoidance and refusal. And this is the functional cognitive behavioral model. Basically, what it does is you consider what reinforces the absenteeism, and then interventions are designed targeting that specific reason. So, for example, if we take the first, which tends to be more related to those kind of internalizing disorders, is kids who tend to avoid things at school that trigger negative emotion. So these are kids that basically don't want to feel uncomfortable, right? Anything uncomfortable is to be avoided, right? And so by doing that, they stay home, and that, of course, reinforces that that feeling of relief, which makes the anxiety around being at school stronger. We also, some of the unpleasant things that get school, for example, in this situation, could be things like riding the bus. It could be being in the gym, fire alarms, peers, concerts, speeches, all kinds of things, right? That anything that provokes some kind of unpleasant, uncomfortable emotion. The second one is escaping social situations that trigger fear of judgment. Sometimes these two things in particular can go hand in hand. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, all of these, in fact. However, this is another situation that often keeps kids at home, right? They're basically trying to, escape these unpleasant experiences. The last two, though, are really more about pursuing something that's like outside of school. So pursuing attention from those who are close to them, or pursuing incentives outside of school. When we look at those last two, those tend to be more kind of, positively reinforced, whereas the first two tend to be negatively reinforced. When we're considering these things, though, one of the and deciding treatment wise, like which area we're going to target, I will say that I have seen some kids over time who might start out in, let's say, one or two, kind of in those areas. And then over time, because they're at home all the time, then the 3 or 4 might actually start to maintain that. That may not have began, like that's not how it all started. However, it actually starts to reinforce or maintain why they stay at home. So for example, if you have, let's take a teenager, for example, that starts to avoid school because of, social situations, fear of judgment, kind of panic around that. And so they stay home. Well, the longer they stay home, they realize, well, I also can sleep in. And when I sleep in, I can also play video games, so they start to see that they could do a lot more fun things not being in school. So looking at kind of pursuing those incentives. And that also starts to reinforce, not only are they escaping this idea of fear of judgment, but then they're also being reinforced by getting these things outside of school. Now, to be able to determine which one of those areas should be the focus of treatment, we have to have a good, thorough assessment. So the assessment process is crucial because every kid that presents has a different reason why they don't want to go to school. And we really need to hone in on what is that reason, right? Because if we don't fully understand what's driving it, it's going to be very, very hard to treat it. So for example, if there is a really serious bullying situation that needs to be dealt with between, say, adults, that may not necessarily be the focus of this treatment, right? We don't want to just push a kid to go to school when someone is threatening their safety at school, right? We want to further understand, and particularly if we're talking about, like I said, some of those internalizing disorders and anxiety disorders. We want to be able to focus in on those things to create those interventions. And so if we're going to be pushing kids to go to school, we need to make sure that we fully understand that what we're pushing them to do is something that's safe, right? Now, anxiety is clearly going to tell them that it's not necessarily a safe thing. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But what we don't want to put them in situations that we really do need to address as the adults in their lives. So when we're doing an assessment, there are many different measures that you can use. I indicated here one in particular, which is the School Refusal Assessment Scale Revised, which is in the public domain, which is part of the reason that I mentioned it today, because it's available to any practitioner to be able to use. When you are assessing, though, it is a good idea to assess the child and the adolescent separate, or the child and the parent separately, so that you can really understand from both of their perspectives, again, what might be maintaining this school refusal behavior. So examples of questions, might be, how often does your child refuse school, specifically because she's distressed or upset about school? And then as you're looking at questions like that, you want to start to ask things about, is this more than other kids his or her age? Because it might not be. And if so, we might address this in a much different way. And it may not be, say, for example, an anxiety disorder, but perhaps it is. What situations specifically are they trying to avoid? We need to hone in on those things because, again, they're going to be targets for treatment. Looking at the specific symptoms that they're presenting with, and what are those symptoms and how do they interfere with their functioning? We also want to see how often this occurs. Like, is this like occasional? Is it sporadic? Is it, like I mentioned before, is it only after a holiday break? Is it only after the summer? Is this a new behavior? Like, was this something that's been going on for some time? And as you hone in on that, being able to figure out, okay, like, is this really the area we need to focus on? Another question, again, trying to figure out what's maintaining this is how often does your child refuse school specifically because she wants to avoid social and or evaluative situations at school. So are they only missing because, they have this performance or they have to be in front of people? We need to see, like, how often is this? Is it only these situations? What are these situations? And if they do go and they're able to push through, but it's with lots of distress, what does that look like? What are there panic attacks? Like, what's happening when they do push themselves to go through with that? Third, how often does your child refuse school specifically because she wants to get, I'm using she here, but she wants to get attention from you? How often does your child refuse school specifically because she wants to pursue tangible rewards outside of school? These are all very valid kinds of questions, and getting into the details and the weeds of these is very important, again, to set up your treatment plan. I will say, as these things start to overlap, they become much more complicated to treat. Not to say that they can be treated, of course they can, and this isn't a one size fits all, but we really need to tailor the treatment to the child that's in front of us. All right, so some common diagnoses. So if we look at, and again, breaking these into those kind of 4 functional kind of areas. So the first, these again tend to be more internalizing disorders. So panic disorder, agoraphobia, generalized anxiety disorder, specific phobia, major depressive disorder. Not to say that it can be other things, but these are some of the most common that fall within this category. I often see, if I'm talking just anecdotally about what's presented in my office, in this particular category, I see lots of kind of GAD driving this. There may be sometimes some panic disorder, and maybe some other mood related things, but a lot of times GAD is really at the heart of a lot of these kids that I see. In the second category, in escaping those social situations that trigger fear, judgment, again, social anxiety disorder, probably the most thing anecdotally that presents within my office space. Third, pursuing attention from those close to them, separation anxiety disorder. And then we start to kind of slip into more of those externalizing disorders. So oppositional defiant disorder. And then lastly, the pursuing incentives outside of school, more externalizing disorders. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there is that overlap, and these things can kind of sprout, I guess, out of some of those other categories as another way that maintains keeping them at home. Nevertheless, a lot of times if you see a kid truly presenting purely because they want to pursue things outside of school, they tend to be more of those externalizing disorders. And some of the things we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about some treatment recommendations around each one of these, but focusing heavier on the anxiety side of it. But each one looks slightly different based on the disorder that a child might present with. If we're looking at just not diagnosis specific, but just prevalence rates in general of school avoidance, it tends to be anywhere between 5 to about 28% over kind of a child's lifetime. If we're looking at the number of children, 5 to 28%, over the course of, an academic career, show up at some point or another with some level of school avoidance that interferes with their functioning. Now, another caveat as we talk kind of diagnostically, I think that, suicidal kinds of thoughts, behavior can accompany any one of these things. And first and foremost, we want to, treat and address that first. And a kid needs to be safe before we move forward with these other kinds of treatments. During COVID, it was right at the beginning of COVID, we saw an increase in adolescent suicide rates at the beginning, and then it kind of dropped off, but numbers are still high. And I will say again, anecdotally, one of the things when kind of doors opened back up, people started to come more to things in person. One of the things that we noticed was a lot of kids who were getting referred from inpatient psychiatric hospitals who had never had any kind of mental health treatment previously, and who basically kind of things had culminated to this like crisis level, who were being referred. And so I do think that, the pandemic definitely, like I said, exacerbated things and created issues for some kids that may or may not have had pre-existing stuff before. So before I get to the specific recommendations, I wanted to talk through just some general recommendations around school avoidance that also very much apply to some of those kids, the transient ones, the ones that where like this problem fades, they get to school, we're great, right? When we're looking at managing this, I think that families need to consider this as like a systems issue. It's not just the child's got to do something different. Oftentimes it's across the board. It's lots of things within the household and the family, but also in collaboration with the schools. So it's the third one on here, but collaborating and communicating with the schools is crucial from the get-go. Even one day of a kid refusing to go to school or having struggles to get there, communicating with the teachers, communicating with counselors, being on the same page where you're kind of a unified front to support the kid, but also in a firm manner is really important right away. Like the earlier intervention, the better in terms of trying to address this and not let it get really out of control. As I mentioned earlier, especially with schools about to be starting, trying to establish some semblance of a routine. I even tell parents for kids who are missing, it is crucial that if they are not going to school, that they are still getting up at school time. During the day, they're not doing fun things if they're not at school. They shouldn't be on their phones, shouldn't be doing electronics, shouldn't be engaging with friends. They need to be doing the same kinds of things they would be at school, and probably even more boring than school, in order to try to motivate them to go back. They need to have supervision, and we want to make school more appealing than being at home, because it becomes, again, very reinforcing if I miss school, I get to sleep in and I can play video games all day. And then afterwards I hang out with my friends still. Like those kinds of things definitely will sabotage families' efforts to get a child back to school. So I also think, it's very important to have exposure outside of the house. Even if you're a family who tend to be kind of homebodies, and maybe during the summer when you didn't get out much, and same with, again, if this is during the school year and they started to avoid, we need to get out of the house. We need to be going places. We need to be around people. We need to be having some expectations around that. I've also had families who will kind of, just the mention of school creates a meltdown. So we just don't talk about it. That's like the absolute opposite of what you should be doing. I know intuitively, like you think like, okay, as a parent, I want to protect my kid. And in that sense, with anxiety, it's really honestly the opposite. So our desire to kind of rescue and save actually ends up making the circumstance worse for them. So we want to support them. We want to understand. And we also want to hold them accountable and push them. And we want to help them to be successful outside of the home. So while we're doing this, we need to really focus on their effort and not the outcome. So I tell parents all the time, if your kid has been out of school for 6 weeks, we're not suddenly just going back, next week, every hour, and everything's going to be great, right? We're going to have to break some of this stuff down, and we'll talk about that, as we talk about the specific treatment recommendations. But we're going to focus on just these small steps and effort and not the outcome. I think there's plenty of kind of cheesy bumper stickers or whatever that say like progress, not perfection, but truly that is the goal here. Like we're looking at taking those strides forward and not perfection. We want to make some efforts to be able to get them back on track. Questions so far before we head into some of the more specific treatment recommendations based on those functional areas? No.
Don't think I'm seeing any.
Okay, good deal.
Okay.
All right. So these specific treatment recommendations, again, we're going to talk about those 4 functions of school refusal. So let's start with the first, which is avoiding things at school that trigger emotion, negative emotion. So when we're looking at these kiddos, like I said, a lot of times this is kids with a generalized anxiety disorder. And so the first part of treatment really focus not just on the child base. The child base is crucial, though, for them to understand that having some of these, and again, I hate using even the word negative emotion, right? Because it creates some kind of dichotomy that's not really there. Emotions are emotions, and kids and adults, right? Like whatever you feel is valid. It just is. It's a feeling, right? So trying to give them, you're teaching them about not only anxiety, but about the way in which our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors all interact. I often use, let's see, I did see something pop up. What about rewarding efforts? Yes, absolutely. I think that I am going to address that, because I think that we are going to talk about in each one of these categories, regardless of the function, that we are going to talk about rewarding the efforts. Now, the rewards might look different. So they're not always going to necessarily be tangible kinds of things. But if we're talking about praise, whether or not that be for the grown-ups in their life, giving them praise and praising their efforts, it may also be about teaching them ways to be able to praise themselves. So the way in which they kind of talk to themselves. And this might be positive experiences, those kinds of things. And we lean a little heavier on those. As we get to some of those more externalizing disorders, though, we do tend to use more kinds of tangible things, and sometimes even behavior plans or charts for those, as opposed to sometimes these more of these internalizing kids. We want to give them a lot of positive attention for the efforts that they've made. So that's a great question. So with these child-based kind of like psychoeducation, again, we're teaching about kind of the way thoughts, feelings, and behaviors interact. Sometimes, though, these kids can be a younger group, particularly if we're talking about some young kids with separation anxiety. They may not be as cognitively developed to spend a lot of time on kind of thoughts. So introducing kind of the concept, thought bubbles and those kinds of things is okay, but you need to know where the kiddo is at, and not spend a ton of time on something that they just cognitively are unable to understand. So with these kids, talking about also what anxiety is, right? I remind families all the time that anxiety is an okay thing, right? We need some anxiety. Sometimes anxiety is healthy. You know, for a kid who's in my office who really cares like about their grades, I try to explain, like, if you didn't have a little bit of anxiety around that because you care about your grades, you wouldn't be motivated to study for a test, right? Because if you don't care and you don't have any anxiety about, oh, I want to do well, like to drive you, particularly if you were procrastinating around studying, like you're not going to do it, right? Because you don't care, you're indifferent to it. I give families, and a lot of times, especially little kids, but in some of the anxiety treatment literature, it talks about kind of using like a caveman analogy. And we talk about kind of like, here you are, you're a caveman, right? If you have no anxiety or fear and a saber-toothed tiger comes up, right? What's going to happen? And, you know, kids will crack up. They're like, they're going to get eaten. Yes, of course, they're going to get eaten, right? Because the point of it is this natural instinctive desire to keep yourself safe. Like your amygdala is activated, you're trying to stay safe. And so anxiety and fear would get you out of that circumstance. You try to get away. And so I tell them what sometimes happens for some people is that our anxiety kind of, you know, gets out of whack. It's like an overly helpful friend that sometimes is really trying to protect us from things that are not inherently dangerous. So nevertheless, though, your body, which gets to the next part, the somatic control exercises, your body doesn't know the difference. Your body is still going to respond to a test the same way it would a saber-toothed tiger, because inherently there's this internal kind of fear response. And then sometimes panic, right? And so part of this is being aware of the way we think about things, right? The stuff that's popping into our mind, how that impacts our feelings, how that then impacts that physiology and impacts then our behaviors, which often, in this case, is avoidance for a lot of kids. There are a number of ways to kind of target this, and different programs that, you know, you can pull different pieces from. For example, Kindle has Coping Cat. And we can pull different things to try to teach these concepts. And one of the things that I love about this is that you can still have fidelity to kind of this functional model and still have some flexibility as you pull different things to teach kids these different kinds of skills. So if we take those somatic control exercises, you know, at the heart of it, what we're looking at is teaching kids about kind of their body, again, the physiology, breathing, progressive muscle relaxation. There's a variety of things, and you have quite a bit of flexibility about which one of those like exercises. If you go to any number of books, right, any number of CBT books, there's a million ways to kind of go about like teaching those. And you have to know the kid that's sitting in front of you to select one that resonates with that kid, right? So that it sticks, so that you can build their buy-in for why they need to manage some of that physiological stuff. Because again, the goal is not for us to eliminate anxiety. That's not happening. Our goal is to manage some of this stuff. And this idea that being uncomfortable is something to be avoided, right? We want to help them see that that's not necessarily the case. As a human being, we want them to be able to live their lives and take reasonable kind of risk to be able to do that. I joke with some kids, technically walking is a very dangerous thing if you think about it, right? And they're like, well, of course I'm going to walk, right? And there's risk involved in walking, right? Could you fall and break your leg? Could you fall and hit your head? Like there are all kinds of things. And we still do it because that's like part of life. And they most of the time can get kind of, especially little kids can get that concept because they think it's so silly. Like, of course I'm going to walk, right? And of course we want you to go to school. Next, of course, we use exposure-based strategies. So a lot of times this is a gradual reintroduction to school and involves kind of this over time, a systematic desensitization. So sometimes we're doing kind of imaginal things in the office and then leading into these kind of in vivo exposures. Now, this looks a little bit different based on each kid, how much they've been out of school, what's the extent of it. Maybe they go but don't go to class. I mean, this is going to vary greatly based on the kid sitting in front of you, your specific hierarchy, and how you're going to go about targeting that. And to Kim's question earlier, that's where the self-reinforcement and then even external reinforcement for engaging in these exposures is really going to be crucial to trying to help them to move forward in getting back to school full time. We really are trying to teach them to be better problem solvers overall. I mean, we're looking at, here's this, circumstance that in their mind a lot of times has been built up to be, this really huge thing, and this avoidance of any, again, negative kinds of emotions or what they would label to be negative kinds of emotions. And we really want to help them see that we can sit and we can tolerate that. Another thought like about the somatic control exercises, I think that those are really important in the sense that most kids too are like, breathing's not going to fix this. And it's like, well, it's not just about breathing, right? Like, and we're not looking to fix anything. We're looking to give you tools to be able to better manage. And even for kids who have panic attacks, we kind of talk through like, how long do your panic attacks usually last, right? Most of the time, 5 to 10 minutes. So if we're looking at sometimes these like this level of distress, most of the time, like your body naturally kind of calms itself, even without you using tools after that time period. It doesn't mean you're not still upset, but in terms of that kind of panic. And so the sooner we can start to apply some of those skills when, if, for example, you're using, say, a feelings thermometer, when it's lower on the thermometer, when it's not gotten out of control, the better able we are to manage that. I use with kids too, a lot of examples, especially if they play sports. About practice and hitting a home run, right? You don't just go up and you hit a home run, right? And you've never swung a bat before. It's practice. It's constant practice, right? So that in the game you can hit the home run. And so part of this stuff with breathing is we're practicing this breathing stuff even when you're not anxious, so that you have some of this muscle memory, and so that when things just start to go up, right, a little bit, you're able to implement these strategies. A piece of that tied back to the psychoeducation is also about them being much more aware of what's going on in their body, because they often try to avoid dealing with that too, which is why many of them will describe kind of going from 0 to 10 very quickly. And because they've ignored and tried to avoid all of the red flags that led up to it. And we want to help them bring some awareness to some of that smaller discomfort to try to engage in that sooner. All right, so questions about avoiding things that trigger negative emotion. Okay. All right, next. These are some of my most...
Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Dr. Keller. We did get a question from Nancy Spangler, so I wanted to read that out.
Oh, go for it.
Seems like the somatic control exercises could be great for kids who have physical symptoms that become a cause for school absence. Any other recommendations specifically for this cohort?
Yes. So I would say somaticizing kids are a big part of both of these groups. We'll see lots of headaches, stomach aches. Part of that is about kind of talking to them a little bit about some of their, like, again, psychoeducation around visceral hypersensitivity, especially for those who have diarrhea or sometimes vomit. What I always talk with families about, though, is first and foremost, we make sure that they've seen their pediatrician and we have truly ruled out any true physical causes, because we do not want to invalidate a child who has a very serious medical condition that we need to treat, and this is not anxiety. Even with that being said, though, let's say it is anxiety, their symptoms are still real and intrusive and valid. And we want to help them to recognize over time that they can have those symptoms and still function. And so a lot of times with those somaticizers, it requires quite a bit of work with the schools and having, so sometimes this could be on the parent part, but particularly if you have a provider, sometimes talking with the school nurse and the teachers where they have a plan that this kid is going in every single day with a stomach ache or saying they threw up, right? And most of the time school's like, oh, and out you go. If they know that anxiety is really the big issue, we've gone to the pediatrician, we've ruled out this stuff. Part of what they do is then having a plan about helping them to, maybe rest for a minute or eat some crackers and then back into the classroom. So we really, and in terms of the exposure part of it, we really start to come up with plans that do not involve sending them home, because the more these kiddos get sent home, the more, again, reinforces the desire, and then the more illness we get. Now, again, they definitely have legitimate symptoms. I really want to say that these are kids who really aren't just making up that they have a headache and a stomach ache and all of this stuff. Like they do, and they feel like really crappy. And we want to help them to learn to be able to manage, even when you feel crappy, you could still do some of these things. Because again, we want them to be able to tolerate some levels of distress. Does that answer that question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so back to these socially anxious kids. So I really think that with these kids, a lot of times too, that parents sometimes, as a forewarning to parents, if you are, oftentimes bragging about, how much your kid doesn't get in trouble, they never go out on the weekend, they're never asking to use the car, they're never, basically just kind of they're in the background, even at the school, if the teacher's like, well, most of the time I don't even notice they're there. This is problematic. These are kiddos and teens that are very socially anxious, are avoiding and escaping and successful at it, right? Which is reinforcing more of this anxiety. And so when these kids come to me, I really want to work with them to try to be able to get them back to school, but not just back to school and thriving, right? We want to help these kids who overestimate these judgments. They have very much an internal focus, hyper internal focus on what everybody else thinks about them. So this will oftentimes involve much more cognitive restructuring than, say, the previous group. That group, depending on the age, does involve some cognitive restructuring. I don't want to pretend like it doesn't, but this group in particular will definitely focus in quite a bit on those thoughts and potentially some distorted thoughts around it. This also, in terms of treatment that's not listed here, we also may be doing some kind of social skills, role plays, and those kinds of things to try to help them practice. One of my favorite things as we look at kind of the exposure, the gradual reintroduction to school, I try the best that I can to utilize anything and everything, even in our office, from on their hierarchy to maybe having to check themselves in for their appointments, to going and asking another provider for something, to using my phone to call a business to ask question. I will use whatever we need to do as experiments, even right in-house, to try to help to get them back into school. Again, from a school standpoint, it depends on the degree in which they have been out of school, what that's going to look like, right? Again, on the extreme end, if they've not been at school, getting them even to, drive. I have had kids where we start out where they just get up in the morning and they drive to the school, even if they just sit in the parking lot. We're sitting in the parking lot, we're going. And maybe we do that every single day for a week. And maybe the next week we drive to the school and they get out and maybe they at least walk to the door. Maybe they walk to the door and maybe the counselor meets with them for 5 minutes. Maybe they go and sit in the counselor's office for a while. Maybe they only attend a preferred class, every day for a while. We will hone in on whatever we need to do to be able to get them back to school. But again, this hierarchy and these exposures are going to be very unique to the child in front of you and what their circumstances, which is why the assessment is crucial. You need to fully understand the things that are keeping them out of school in order to create targets that are actually going to help them get back to school. I think I saw a question pop up. Yes. So Taylor, thank you for that. I think that is so important, because I do not like when we have not fully assessed these kids and teens for physical health problems, because I have had many who have actually had underlying medical problems. And I think that, again, they may also have accompanying anxiety that we could still treat, and we need to ensure that we are providing them support to be able to deal with sometimes those underlying physical health issues. And Crohn's is an example of that, particularly when we're looking at the hypervisceral sensitivity, which IBS, some of those kinds of things that very much like this kid is, in the bathroom with diarrhea all the time. Like that is very legitimate and impacts school, and we need to help them to be successful, right? And we need to acknowledge that those are very real things. Along the same lines, I mentioned Kendall earlier. But he, with Coping Cat, there's a fear plan. And for both this and the previous one, a fear plan is something sometimes we teach kids to, in terms of a way to kind of organize their, the treatment of the symptoms. So the fear plan is an acronym. So fear is, the F is feeling anxious, kind of like with a question mark. The E is expecting bad things to happen, question mark. A is attitudes and actions that can help, and R is the results and rewards. And so it gives them I love acronyms, and I'm a visual person. So with kids, this works very well. We want to give them something concrete as a framework as we teach these very things to be able to use as they're out in the world and as they're doing these things to be able to manage. There's another acronym, it's STOP, which is, am I scared? Let's see, what are the thoughts? What are other more realistic thoughts? And then I think the P is praise. So there are various acronyms around in the anxiety world, particularly the CBT anxiety world, about like ways in which to target this, but those also give kids a lot of kind of structure around trying to organize these skills and how to prioritize them. I think, somatic control exercise, I want to do this again, that like for some kids who are so avoidant, there are times too that I will do things in my office, like we will do, 1,000,000, jumping jacks together in my office to get our heart rates up, to show the level of control you can have in terms of breathing to bring your heart rate back down. We'll do things, kids who are very afraid of it. And again, this is not a kid who has like vertigo or has other kinds, but dizziness from anxiety or thinking they're going to pass out. We'll spin in a chair to then be able to kind of ground ourselves and breathe and be able to push through that, so that they can then, we want them to have evidence contrary to all this stuff that the anxiety is telling them. So we have to give them these opportunities to be able to find this level of it, evidence and we want to start small because we want them to be successes. We want to build on success after success. So we have this evidence. In most of the anxiety literature too, we talk about being kind of like thought detectives and trying to test these out. And we really create these experiments for them, because I know that a lot of times for some parents and even some teachers I've heard too, don't worry, there's nothing to worry about. Everything's going to be okay. And the thing is, that's everyone means well. And one, you can't guarantee that for a kid, and they know that, and it won't help them. Part of it is asking them questions to better understand what is it that you're afraid is going to happen. And you start to ask those questions about being a thought detective, right? Like, well, how often does that happen? Like, has that ever happened to anybody else? Is that, if you're afraid, you're going to die, like, has that happened to anybody else? How likely is that? You're starting to ask them questions because you're helping them to poke holes in some of this. And then we create experiments together for the contrary. Okay, let's see. I think I saw another thing pop up. I like the halted method. Seems to resonate with kids in my experience. Am I hungry? Oh, that's a good one too. Am I angry? Am I lonely? Yes, around like different feelings. Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Oops, I didn't mean to jump ahead. All right. So pursuing attention from those close to them. So a lot of times, I mentioned this tends to be kind of kids with a separation anxiety disorder. Not always. Like this can be other diagnoses, like we talked about, but that's one of the most common things that they are afraid something bad is going to happen to them. They don't want to be apart from them. I think that one of the things that I work with parents often, because a lot of times I mentioned this is a systemic kind of issue. Parents, their desire is to kind of rescue, right? And they want to keep them safe. But remember, like this is not a circumstance, like the anxiety is not something to rescue them. We need to see the big picture. We want to help them to be successful when they are outside of our care. And so sometimes this works in the way of kind of modifying the way the parents talk to the kid, giving commands only one at a time, eye contact on their level, no lecturing, having neutral tone, listening to what they have to say, but also being firm. There tend to be a lot of parent-focused interventions, depending on the age of the kid, to really help the parent manage some of the things these kids throw to them. I see even with teenagers, though, particularly with separation anxiety, who are texting a parent in I've seen some of these chains, hundreds, they're in every class, they're sending text after text about making sure the parent's okay or needing them to come get them, wanting reassurance. And so just this constant, so even that, in that as we create some of these interventions, might be about the kid trying to reduce doing some of those things, but it also may be about the parent addressing and having kind of a firm supportive response, but then not constantly engaging and reinforcing that excessive reassurance seeking. So I think that, with that being said, one of the things that around this kind of area, they always talk about the grandma's rule, which is the pre-MAC principle, like you can't, you can have your dessert like after you eat your dinner. But the idea is basically you take this thing that in school, in this case, might be this unpleasant thing, and pairing it with something desirable after that. And so figuring out for that kid, what kind of reward, what would that look like? And again, it simply might be more time spent together. It might be a lot of praise. It could be tangible things. But really trying to focus your attention on giving more attention to the behaviors that you want to increase and less attention to those that we do not. And so we don't want to reinforce some of those things. Okay, it looks like, we're almost out of time. So pursuing incentives outside of school, this tends to be more of those family-based interventions. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to talk much about this at all. These tend to be more of those externalizing disorders like ODD, conduct disorder. And this also involves a lot of work with the school, particularly because some of these kids that truancy is an issue. And so again, this is kind of beyond the scope for today, but I wanted to let you know that is one of those target areas. And then, of course, relapse prevention. Once we get a kid back to school, it's very important for us to not get kind of just laissez-faire about it. This is not a time period where to throw our hands, well, we've accomplished this, we're done. Whatever you did that worked, you need to keep doing to ensure that they remain in school. Because remember, we talked about developmentally, it's normal. At almost each transition, we're going to get some, I don't want to go, school's so terrible, right? We're going to get that. And so we need to be prepared, as well as the kid, so that we can be successful along these transitions. So before I open it up for last minute questions, here's the references. I want to show you a couple of books. These are ones I recommend to parents all the time. So this one here is You and Your Anxious Child by Albano. And she is fabulous. One of the fabulous kind of child researchers around just anxiety in general. So this is a good anxiety in general book that I recommend to parents. This one is Chansky, and this is Freeing Your Child from Anxiety. This is another one that I often recommend to parents. Again, great read along just anxiety in general. Both have tiny portions about school avoidance. And then this one is also a great resource, which Kearney is a big researcher in the area of school refusal and avoidance. And this is Getting Your Child Back to School. So this one in particular is a really great resource because it is very much targeted specific to the stuff we're talking about today, all four of those functional areas, but is really for parents maybe before they've reached out to for treatment, something that they're trying to do on their own. All right. So I flew through that last part. Oops. Any other questions?
So Dr. Keller, we do have one question in the Q&A, and it's,
I think, and this is part of the reason that I think it's so crucial that we do not tell kids, oh, it'll be okay. It's fine, don't worry about it. Those are very legitimate and real fears. And unfortunately, in the day and age that we live in, those are things that we really need to be addressing and having conversations with them. And so I think the way I approach it often is about taking a problem solving approach. And oftentimes schools now are doing active shooter drills and those kinds of things the same way we do with tornadoes, fires, those kinds of things. And I often approach school shootings in the same way I do with the kids who are afraid of tornadoes, fires, because that is a super common fear too, of not wanting to go in those drills. And we talk about, like, yeah, that really is a possibility, but the likelihood still statistically tends to be very low. But we talk about the things that they can do, what's within their control to be able to manage those thoughts and the reactions, and to be able to move forward and still be able to attend school. I definitely think, though, that is a really good example of why we don't just tell kids it's going to be okay, because we cannot guarantee that.
There's also a question about sharing the recommended readings that you've mentioned. If we could maybe post those to our website, which I believe would be possible. Great.
And also, just so you know, again, I get no royalties for that. Those are frequent resources I recommend to families, but I just prefer those.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Keller? I want to just give a minute if people are typing away. And I definitely want to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Keller for the presentation. It was very interesting and informative. And remind everyone that the webinar is recorded. It will be up on the website. I have put in the chat the link for the certificate of attendance, and you just need to click on that link and then enter the password to get access to that. Looks like maybe we've gotten a couple of questions. Thoughts on transitioning from online back to in-person for school?
Yeah, I think that that, especially with COVID, right, was a very tough transition. And so some of what I had to work some with schools, but also having the parents work with the school about, they had offered some of the school districts, it was like a partial kind of thing, which was some days in person and some via online. And I pushed some parents like, yes, we have to do this, because that was like the smoother transition for some of them, where some days they had to go and then we increased that attendance, or maybe even on an online day, they went for some activity at school or met with a counselor. But the more we can get them in that building, the better off.
All right. I don't see that we have any other questions. Want to remind everyone that we do have these webinars every second and fourth Thursday of the month at noon, and they are free. The next one will be on August 24th, and the topic of that webinar will be on treating narcissistic abuse through connection. So we'd like to encourage everyone to come. And thank you again to Dr. Keller. Hope everyone has a good day. Bye-bye.